The first known virus ever to infect a personal computer was named Brain.A. It was developed, dare we say invented, by two Pakistani brothers, Basit and Amjad Alvi. We know this because, amusingly, they signed their work and included contact information in the code of the virus. Brain.A was first detected in January 1986. In its initial form, the virus did no significant harm. All it really did, in effect, was change fine to brain, and as a result, it could freeze some computers. Basit and Amjad say they meant no harm from their creation. They were just trying to show that it could be done. In 2011, a Scandinavian cyber expert, Mikko Hyponen, went to Pakistan to look them up, and he found the brothers still living at the same address. In a bit of poetic justice, they complained to him that they were constantly suffering from virus infections on their own computers. The world has changed. Each whole generation, we've gone from novelty to very real threats in cyberspace. Hardly a day goes by without news of some new cyber attack or intrusion that causes widespread consternation. Simply by way of example, on a random week in mid-July 2011, Hack Group Anonymous announced what it called Military Meltdown Monday, a large-scale hack of the IT systems of Booz Allen Hamilton, a major federal military contractor. The next day, there was a malware attack targeted at Frenchmen celebrating Bastille Day. Just a few days earlier, it was Syrian security forces that hacked into social media to spread disinformation in support of President Bashar Assad against protesters in his own country. And seemingly every day, we see simple invasions of privacy, whether through the theft of identity, the hacking of voicemail systems, of the sort that led to the scandal in 2011 and the shutdown of Britain's News of the World. The list goes on. Vulnerability in cyberspace is an everyday reality. Malicious actors want access to your systems to disable, disrupt, degrade, or destroy it. We call those the 4 horrible Ds of computer hacking. But how exactly does it work? How, after all, can Anonymous take on a corporate giant like Booz Allen Hamilton? And how bad is it? That's what we'll be talking about in today's lecture. We're going to learn about the instruments that are used to exploit the vulnerabilities we discussed in our last lecture. After all, you can't tell the players without a scorecard, and you can't understand cybersecurity if you don't know what the threats are. By the end of today's lecture, you'll know the difference between a Trojan and a logic bomb. You'll know something about how they work, and you'll know what you should be on the lookout for. Let's start with a common frontal assault, something known as a DDoS attack, or Distributed Denial of Service attack. These types of assaults are relatively easy to mount, but also less harmful than other types of attacks we'll talk about. The DDoS attack takes advantage of the fact that even though the cyber network is huge, it is still limited physically. Remember, the physical layer of the network is key. There is only so much bandwidth and so many servers that any one company has. Think back to our discussion of Google in the second lecture. The reason Google has 6 US servers and 13 globally, and it'll be adding more in the coming years, is to handle the growing number of connection requests it gets from people around the world. So now, imagine you're a smaller company, say a local bank. You've built your system with servers and bandwidth to handle a number of inquiries, let's say 1,000 every second. What happens if all of a sudden your server is getting 100,000 requests every second? Well, the answer's obvious. It's like trying to drink from a fire hose, and the server simply gets overwhelmed. In a DDoS attack, some malicious actor decides to flood a website with requests to connect. These malicious requests drown out all the legitimate requests, and it's almost as if the website were taken offline. Nobody can get through. That's exactly what happened in late 2012 when someone, we think it was the Iranians, launched a denial of service attack on several large American banks. For 3 or 4 days, lots of people, including me, couldn't do their online banking. Now, it's worth noting here that it is only the access that is affected at this point. Nothing happens to the data at the target company. That's one reason why professionals think of DDoS attacks as really just annoying cyber graffiti on a small scale. Though when they happen on a larger scale, perhaps a better analogy is cyber vandalism. So, how do you arrange for a website to be accessed 100,000 times a second? It isn't easy. You can't do it all by yourself. You have to have a bunch of friends and allies to help you. That's why we call it a distributed denial of service attack. The attacks come from a distributed network of helpers. If you volunteer to join the attack, which is essentially what folks in the hacktivist group Anonymous do, recruit allies to help them in their attacks, you don't even have to know how to program your computer. You can, quite for free, download a program known as the Low Orbit Ion Cannon, or LOIC. Despite its science fiction name, the LOIC is just a simple automated program. Give it the web address or server you want to attack, hook it up to the internet, and push start. You don't even have to stay around. It runs on its own. If enough people join the attack, well, then the target can be completely cut off. And it really doesn't take that many people for an attack to work. One recent study said that for a large company like MasterCard to be taken offline, it would need just as few as 700 dedicated attackers who might be involved. And now it gets even more interesting. We tend to think of attackers as having volunteered to join the DDoS attack. But the truth is that not everyone is a volunteer. In fact, quite to the contrary. Many DDoS attacks are carried out by computers that have innocent owners. The computers are, in fact, controlled by someone else. As I mentioned in the last lecture, we call these networks of controlled computers botnets, short for robot networks, because the innocent computers are controlled, like robots, by someone else. Sometimes we also call the innocent computers zombies for much the same reason. One thing is for sure, the computer hacking world has some interesting names and descriptions. So, how does a botnet work? Well, first, the innocent computer has to be infected with some piece of malware. How that happens is something we'll talk about in just a minute. For now, let's focus on what that program does. And all it really does is phone home, a lot like E.T. from the movie. Depending upon how sophisticated the program is, who it calls and where it calls can change. But the nuts and bolts are that, periodically, when the innocent zombie computer is connected to the network, it calls out to a controller computer for instructions. Now, often, there are no instructions at all, and then the malware does nothing until its next scheduled check-in time. But sometimes, the command and control program sends out instructions. Something like, at precisely noon Greenwich Mean Time on July 4, try to connect to globalmegacorp.com. That command will have come from the owner of the botnet, who's sometimes called the botnet herder, as if the zombie computers were sheep to be herded. And then, at noon GMT on July 4th, all the computers connected to the broader web follow the instructions. Not every computer that is instructed is online at the time, but you don't need all of them. Say 700 respond, well then, bam, there you have a botnet attack. This is also, as we discussed, how scammers and frauds arrange for spam to be sent. They rent out botnets from the herder and buy email addresses that have been harvested on the web. A small botnet can send out an awful lot of spam very, very quickly, unfortunately. And how are the email addresses harvested? With a spider, also sometimes called a web crawler. As the name implies, these are automated programs that crawl around the internet harvesting information, much like a spider catches flies. If, for example, your email is on a corporate website, the web crawler can harvest it. Botnets can vary in size, of course. Some have hundreds of zombie slaves. Others have tens of thousands of zombie computers that they control. In our last lecture, we talked about the Configure botnet, with at least 9 million zombies. Most of the botnets are constantly active, literally every second of every day, sending spam or doing some other sort of malevolent activity. So, how does a botnet get into your computer in the first place? Well, besides sending spam, a botnet malware program usually does one other thing. It tries to spawn itself by infecting other innocent computers. Typically, that's through an email message or some other innocent form of communication. So let's take a look at that for a little bit now. I'm sure that everyone listening to this lecture has gotten one of those really suspicious emails. You know the ones. They come from someone in your address book, and you're in the sender's address book as well, and often they're just a simple website address, a hyperlink for you to click on. I got one just the other day which helpfully said, "Open the attachment." I hope everyone listening knows enough not to click on those links. They'll take you to web pages where embedded malware lives, and that could be the start of becoming a zombie, or even something worse. I also hope you know that if it sounds too good to be true, well, then it is. There really just aren't many pictures of famous movie stars naked out there on the network. But that kind of simplistic attack is not what a moderately cautious, sophisticated user should be afraid of. So let's look at a more subtle type of attack, a malicious intrusion that goes by the generic name of a Trojan horse, or more simply, Trojan. They're called Trojans because, typically, the malware is hidden inside a program that looks like an innocent piece of information, just like the famous Trojan horse had Greeks hidden inside. To understand how this type of cyber intrusion works is in some ways pretty technical, a complexity that reflects the intricacy of these types of attacks. But if you follow along, we can unpack some of the jargon and understand what is happening in a typical attack. Usually, an attack begins with the simple Trojan communication. Often it's just an email to someone. This is sometimes called a spear phishing email because it targets a specific individual or recipient, much like a spear used to catch a particular fish. Instead of a generic message that fits almost anyone, it will have a message designed specifically for you or a narrow target group. The other day, for example, I got one that purported to have a link to a news article about cybersecurity policy proposals for President Obama's second term. The sender obviously knew something about topics I was interested in. Now, these spear phishing emails are designed to appear as though they've come from an innocent source, but they will have a malicious program hidden within, either in the email itself or, quite possibly, in an attachment. When the unsuspecting recipient clicks on the attachment, the malware begins the automated download of a controller program. This program then opens up a backdoor communication channel, allowing outside individuals access to the programs that control the target system. When the communications open up, the attackers flood the system, much like a tank brigade moving through the breach in a defensive line. Some of the attackers come in and create new breaches. Others use their position to promote themselves within the system and give themselves authority to access all the data available. If it's a quick hit-and-run attack, they begin removing information from the target system, like your login codes or your financial data. In short, the simple email cracks open the security of the target, and then a team of cyber specialists exploit the defensive gap. The intrusion doesn't have to be a quick hit-and-run. There is another class of attacks that are called generically Advanced Persistent Threats, or APTs. These are intrusions inside the target system for a long period of time, and in effect make the target computer vulnerable to continuous monitoring from the outside. These types of intrusions are by far the most common on the network today. To see how these APTs work, let's look at one called GhostNet. GhostNet was found in March 2009 in the computers operated by the offices of the Dalai Lama. GhostNet began just as we've already described. Malware was hidden in an email that was from a trusted source, freetibet.org, and it contained a real document, a directory of friends and individuals around the globe who were friends of Tibet. It looked completely innocent, but it contained a Trojan horse program that avoided the Dalai Lama's intrusion detection system to insert itself into the operating system of the Dalai Lama's servers. This program, in turn, communicated with controller servers operated by somebody outside of the Dalai Lama's organization. They used the new malicious software to take remote control of the Dalai Lama's computer system. Acting remotely, the installers could turn on a keystroke logger. A logger, as its name implies, is a program that captures all of the keystrokes entered on a keyboard attached to a computer. In this case, the laptops and keyboards in the Dalai Lama's office. Imagine what that means, for example, if an official within the Dalai Lama's organization was typing in the, say, password to his bank account at the Bank of India. Also remotely, those who controlled the malicious software were able to turn on the video cameras and microphones on the computers in the offices of the Dalai Lama. Using the camera and microphone, the bad guys could see and hear anything that was happening within range of the computer. And they did this without anyone in the office knowing that it was happening. It took an information warfare organization from Canada over a year to unravel the chain of controlling computers and find out who was behind the GhostNet attack. In the end, the chain petered out in servers on Hainan Island, which is off the coast of China, and which is, perhaps not coincidentally, also the home of one of the People's Liberation Army's signals intelligence organizations. Now, for fairness' sake, we should note that the Chinese government vehemently denies that it was responsible for this intrusion. But as we'll see in a later lecture, the Chinese have been quite active in cyber espionage. Sometimes the object of an intrusion isn't monitoring for information at all. Sometimes the attack is just intended to leave a package behind, a program that sits quietly in the computer doing nothing at all, waiting. And it'll continue to wait until it gets the signal to act, maybe from the outside, or maybe the program has a preset day and time in which to act. And then the program will explode into action. We call these silent programs logic bombs, though to my way of thinking, they're more like logic mines. One of the big concerns we have today is that we don't really know whether there are any logic bombs in some of our networks, and there's no way to really find out. There's one other attacking concept I want to share with you today, the idea of a zero-day vulnerability. A zero-day exploit is one that the attacker is sure will work because it's never been used before. The vulnerability becomes known on the same day that the attacker uses it to take advantage of someone. Hence, we say that it will work on the 0th day, or that there are 0 days between when the vulnerability is discovered and when it is used. Let me explain that a bit more. In cyberspace, most vulnerabilities are gaps in programming code that, when discovered, can be exploited by outsiders. After all, most operating programs have tens of thousands of lines of code in them. Really big ones, like the operating system for Windows or Apple's computers, have millions of lines. It is completely unsurprising that sometimes mistakes creep into the code, mistakes that can be exploited by malicious outsiders. These vulnerabilities all go by obscure technical names like SQL injection and TDL rootkit vulnerability. The names, they almost don't matter. And for the average user, the details aren't particularly interesting. All that matters is that particular flaws in the code allow outsiders to force the computer code to do unanticipated things, often with some really adverse consequences. But once the vulnerability is exposed and exploited, it can also be fixed by software designers. That's why security software firms are constantly shipping updates to your computer, and software developers are constantly recommending that users download patches for their software. They are providing you with the fixes to vulnerabilities that have recently been discovered, most often because some malicious actor has taken advantage of them. For this reason, new vulnerabilities, ones that have not been exploited before, are a valuable commodity for bad actors. the hackers save them up and use them for important acts because they're unlikely to have been patched and almost sure they will work. These zero-day exploits are the coin of the realm. Using one of them in an attack is standard in more sophisticated attacks. Two is a little profligate. Indeed, one reason we know that the Stuxnet attack that we talked about in the first lecture was doubtless the product of very sophisticated attackers is they used 4 zero-day exploits, a sign of the importance that the developer put on the success of the attack. Of course, so far, we've been talking about attacks on computer servers, but, and this will be a theme as we go along, you should always remember that cyberspace is much bigger than the internet and the World Wide Web. Everything that is attached and addressable is part of the domain. In July 2012, for example, a group of researchers at the University of Texas at Austin Radio Navigation Laboratory succeeded in hijacking a drone by fooling the Global Positioning System, or GPS, on board the aircraft. With around $1,000 in parts, the team took control of an unmanned aerial vehicle owned by the college. And then they showed off their skills to the U.S. Department of Homeland Security. Now, by 2020, there may be tens of thousands of drones in U.S. airspace. Just imagine what it will be like if they can be hijacked by outsiders. You could do a 9/11 attack without the suicide pilots. We should finish our discussion of exactly how cyber intrusions work with a little bit of a look at what the defenders are doing. The first thing, of course, is that the good guys can and do use the same tools as the bad guys. In order for the Canadians to track the GhostNet attack to China, they used some of the same techniques that the Chinese had used, including putting malicious tracking software into some of the computers that were the intermediaries for the Chinese attack. These programs allowed the Canadians to put as a means of tracing it. Of course, defenders also have some of their own unique tools that you may have heard about. I want to mention 2 of them quickly. One particularly useful tool is the honeypot. If programs with malicious software are seeking vulnerable computers to infect, then one of the best and easiest ways to learn about new malware is to capture it before it infects innocent computers, by creating computers that pose as innocents but really aren't. If you want an image, think of the police officer who poses as a prostitute, or the military ship cruising the ocean posing as an unarmed merchant ship. We call these computers honeypots because they're sweet and attractive targets. And malware is a bit like Winnie the Pooh. It never refuses any honey. In a similar vein, spam traps are systems designed to collect and analyze spam so that your filters know how to stop it. If you're like me, you've probably noticed that your spam filter is getting better and you're seeing less of it. In fact, you may actually be missing some real email that gets filtered in the spam. The spam traps are how security firms are making their systems more effective. Now, up until this point, we've been exploring some of the tactics employed in the cyber domain by attackers and defenders alike. What I'd like to do next is talk a little bit about the scope of the problem. After all, if there are vulnerabilities but nobody ever exploited one, we wouldn't really care, would we? So perhaps we should ask the question, just how significant is the problem of cyber attacks today? Sadly, though the question is really a vital one, data on actual vulnerabilities and their effects are very hard to come by. First, we don't have any good information about the number of intrusions that happen on a daily basis. It's such a large number that the US government actually stopped counting several years ago. The frequency was too great. Clearly, though, there does seem to be a lot of churn on the network. One massive study of internet traffic conducted for Bell Canada in 2010 demonstrated the scope of the problem. They reviewed 839 petabytes of data, that's a huge amount, containing over 4 billion emails each month, carrying more than 174 billion Canadian dollars of commerce every day. Within this flood of data, over 53 gigabytes per second contain malicious code of some sort. So if you want a comparison, that's roughly the size of 1,200 songs on your iPod every second, every day, malicious. In Canada alone, the investigators observed on the order of 80,000 zero-day exploits per day and estimated that more than 1.5 million compromised computers attempted more than 21 million botnet connections each month. This data is more or less consistent with estimates by large cybersecurity companies. As we noted in our opening lecture, for example, in 2010, Symantec discovered 286 million new unique malicious pieces of malware, and in 2011 it was more than 400 million. In 2012, one German researcher with only 5 employees, 70 million malware samples in his honeypot. 8.5 million of these were new, unique samples. Equally alarming, the DHS Cyber Center that monitors the federal network saw about 15,000 attacks per day. So just imagine what they didn't see. But knowing that there's a lot of activity isn't the same as knowing what effects there are. A 2011 paper produced by PayPal noted, quote, "Estimates of the magnitude and scope of cybercrime vary widely, making it difficult for policymakers and others to determine the level of effort to exert in combating the problem." Close quote. And what is true of cybercrime is true to an even greater degree of instances of cyber espionage of both the industrial and sovereign variety. There is some data on cybercrime, but what we have is unsatisfactory. In 2011, the US-based Internet Crime Complaint Center, the IC3, received more than 314,000 complaints of Internet crime, with reported losses of $485 million. Neither of these numbers is terribly informative about the scope of the problem. The unreported and undetected instances of crime and intrusion are, by definition, unknowable. Indeed, these modest numbers pale next to other, more apocalyptic estimates of malfeasant activity on the network. Former U.S. Deputy Secretary of Defense William Lynn said in 2010, for example, that military systems are probed thousands of times and scanned millions of times every day. Other estimates of the economic costs of cybercrime and cyber intrusions are available and offer some indication of the scope of the problem, but are, in some views, pretty conjectural. In 2011, for example, the consulting firm Dedica estimated that the annual losses from cyber intrusions in the United Kingdom were £27 billion. Now, for comparison's sake, the annual loss from regular non-cyber fraud in the UK is thought to be roughly £73 billion a year. 2 years earlier, McAfee Secure estimated that the annual cybercrime losses globally were $1 trillion a year. Likewise, a cybercrime report from Norton estimates that the direct monetary losses in just the 24 largest countries in the world in 2010 were $114 billion, while other losses from lost time and such were another $274 billion. Grand total, $388 billion lost globally. That's more than the market for marijuana, cocaine, and heroin combined. These estimates may be somewhat inflated by their methodology. The lion's share of the losses are estimated to flow from the theft of intellectual property. In other words, some form of industrial espionage, or the theft of films or music or books, with direct monetary losses estimated to be running an order of magnitude less. More notably, this data is a rough estimate at best, and it's also a bit inherently suspect. Cybersecurity firms like Dedica and McAfee have, after all, an interest in making us concerned. Perhaps somewhat more authoritatively, the U.S. Government Accountability Office, repeating an estimate made by the FBI, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, believes that in 2005, the annual losses due to computer crime was approximately $67.2 billion for U.S. organizations. Now, 2005 was quite a while ago, but this kind of estimation is very hard to do. And as of the day that this lecture was recorded, it's the last time the government took a look. Today, the number can only be higher. The Ponemon Institute is a well-respected internet study think tank. In 2011, they conducted a survey of companies in America. They estimated that the median annual cost of cybercrime to each company was almost $6 million per year, with a range of $1.5 to $36.5 million per organization. One other way to estimate the scope of the cybercrime problem would be to examine how much is spent in preventing intrusions and theft? After all, nobody would expect rational businesses to spend more in prevention than they anticipate in losses. The Internet Security Alliance has estimated that private sector security spending totaled an astonishing $80 billion in 2011. Perhaps even more troubling, another study by Poneman suggested that the amount being spent was less than 10% of what was necessary to stop 95% of all attacks. So in the end, we don't know for sure what the scope, the actual dollar damage of cybercrime really is. From all this, the most that can be said is that there's a lot of risk out there, and that data about actual harm remains painfully elusive. So that's a quick look at how cyber intrusions actually happen and what the scale of the damage is. It's sort of a bestiary of bad animals out there. Keep them in mind, because we'll encounter them again later in this course. In our next lecture, though, we're going to take a short, deeper dive into a single aspect of the cyber intrusion problem: the question of anonymity and of identity on the network. See you then. So, if you're listening to or watching this lecture at home, let's try an experiment. But please, don't do this if you're in the car right now. Wait until you get home. If you're at home, go and turn on your computer. Open up your web browser and pick your favorite search engine. Google, Yahoo, it doesn't matter. And type into the search engine the word whois, W-H-O-I-S, with no spaces. And soon you'll see at least a half dozen links offering whois services. Services that will, in theory, help you identify the people behind various domain names on the internet. Seems like a wonderful service, almost like a Yellow Pages for internet domain names, right? If only it were that simple. It turns out that verifying a person's identity on the network is actually very hard to do. In today's lecture, we'll try and understand why that is so, and what we might do to fix the problem, if it's even a problem at all. Domain names are familiar to everyone who uses the internet. In any web address, the domain name is the portion of the address after http://www. So, for example, the website for my consulting firm is http://www.redbranchconsulting.com. In this case, the domain name is redbranchconsulting.com. Domain names are familiar ways to identify the web page you're trying to reach, or the email address you're sending email to. We know them. We readily recognize them. Microsoft.com, that takes you to Bill Gates' company. And gov.uk, that takes you to the front page of Her Majesty's government in London. Of course, computers don't use names like Microsoft or Her Majesty's government to route traffic. They use numbers. The domain name system, or DNS, is, in effect, a translation system. It takes a domain name and translates it into an Internet protocol address, sometimes shortened, and we call it an IP address. The IP address is a numerical label. It's assigned to every device on the network, a computer, or a printer, or a server. The IP address is written in a format of 4 numbers, each separated by a dot. So, for example, one might be 172.16.254.1. The IP address tells the Internet routing system where a particular server is on the network, and then the Internet protocol tells the system how to get the message from here to there, wherever there may be. So the DNS IP combination is both an identification system, who you are, and an address system, where you are. By the way, and just as an amusing aside, it tells you everything you need to know about the growth of the cyber domain that we're running out of IP addresses to assign. The way the system was originally designed, there were only 4.3 billion IP addresses to hand out. Only. And the last ones went out for assignment in early 2011. But don't worry, the engineers have a fix. It's going to take some time and effort to put it in place, but when they're done, we will have 340 billion IP addresses to use. That's a 34 followed by 37 zeros. So anyway, the DNS link works in a three-stage process. First, an individual, me, Paul Rosenzweig, registers a domain name, say redbranchconsulting.com, which is hosted on a server somewhere. As it happens, Red Branch is hosted on a server owned and operated by a friend of mine. But you can buy your own server if you want to, or rent space on a server farm operated by another company. Second, that server is identified by an IP address. And third, when a potential client wants to access the Red Branch website by typing in that domain name, the DNS programming routes the request to the right server and returns the web page to the client. All of which means that the addressing function of the DNS is absolutely critical. If the domain name system were corrupted, hijacked, or broken, then communications across the entire internet would break down. And it also means that keeping a good registry of which domain names are in use is just as vital. If Microsoft.com is taken by Microsoft, the computer software giant, it can't be used by Microsoft, the hypothetical manufacturer of small, soft washcloths. Somebody needs to be in charge of keeping the books and making sure they're all straight. That somebody is the Internet Corporation for Assigned Names and Numbers, also known as ICANN. ICANN is a nonprofit organization that sets the rules for creating and distributing domain names. As I explained in Lecture 3, the function for assigning names used to be done by a single man back when the Internet was first turned on. That man, John Postel, helped create the first Internet network as a project for the Advanced Research Projects Administration, or ARPA. But since ARPA was a federal government-funded agency, this in effect meant that the naming function was handled by the United States government. In the long run, of course, as the Internet grew to span the globe, a US-run and managed naming system was considered by many outside the United States to be insular and too unilateral. So ICANN was chartered in 1998 to transition control over the Internet from the US government to a nonprofit private sector organization. Today, ICANN operates from California, but it has a global constituency, registering new domain names every day. We'll talk a lot more about ICANN in a later lecture. For now, though, all you need to know is the job that it does. In theory, the domain name system should be completely transparent. Knowing a domain name, the cyber persona of a person or company, you should be able to find out who the real person behind the domain name is. Unfortunately, the system doesn't work as effectively as it should. If you're still at your computer, let's continue the experiment. And again, if you're in your car, don't do this until you get home, please. So first, let's go to one of those Whois sites we found earlier. In some cases, the registry works as we might wish. If you do a Whois search for the domain name heritage.org, you do find the actual organization behind the domain name. In this case, the Heritage Foundation, a think tank located in Washington, D.C. At least you can find the foundation's true address and the name of someone who works there. Try it and you'll see. But in most cases, the Whois function really doesn't help that much. To see that, let's type redbranchconsulting.com into the Whois search box. Now remember, redbranchconsulting.com is the domain name for the consulting company that I founded. When you execute the search, however, you don't get my name. Instead, what you get is a notice that the domain name is registered with a company called GoDaddy.com. GoDaddy, whose ads I'm sure you've seen, is a registry company that works with ICANN to organize the sale of domains. Fortunately, they're a reputable company. So if you have a lawful reason to ask, if, say, you were the police conducting a criminal investigation and you had the correct legal authorization, then GoDaddy would tell you who was behind that domain. Me. The same is true of cyberwarbook.com, which is a domain purchased to promote a book I recently published. When you look up this domain name in a Whois service, you find only that this domain name is registered with Wild West Domains, another company like GoDaddy, this one owned by my cousin. Now, imagine that, unlike a consultant, you actually wanted to hide your identity. The obscurity of the domain name system makes it pretty easy. For example, one can, for a relatively small amount of money, create a shell company registered just about anywhere in the world. So let's say we created Not Great Courses Company in the Cayman Islands. If Not Great Courses then bought the domain name notgreat.com from GoDaddy, the true owners of the company could hide behind the corporate structure to conceal their identity behind the fictional cyber persona. Because domain name registry companies like GoDaddy or Wild West accept identification that appears to be lawful, and because they make no real attempt to verify the information they receive, the Whois registry is littered with errors, some accidental, others quite deliberate. As if the obscurity in the addressing registry weren't enough, there are plenty of other techniques for hiding on the internet. As we talked about in an earlier lecture, messages that transit the net don't automatically come with authentication. They may pretend to be from your friend, but that could be a spoof. That's a communication intended to fool you. For an example, an email from a friend, but with a slightly wrong email address. Or even worse, an email from your friend that is from his real address, but has been sent by someone who hacked into his account and hijacked it. Almost everyone who uses the internet has received at least one communication that's a fraud. I'm stranded in London and need you to send me money has become the modern-day equivalent of I've got a great bridge to sell you in Brooklyn. This kind of blatant fraud and misrepresentation is commonplace. Even worse, many techniques exist to confound any effort to backtrack a message to an original source. It is relatively easy, as a technical matter, to gimmick an IP address so that a message appears to come from one location while actually coming from another. Likewise, in a world where botnets allow a malicious actor to control computers other than his own, it is also quite possible to originate a message from a computer that is not your own, but is under your control. As a result, the commonplace is that virtually every intrusion or attack on the network is obscured behind a farrago of false emails, spoofed IPs, and botnets under the control of a third party. No attacker worth his salt would make any intrusion directly from his own IP address. They're always bounced through a number of false leads before arriving at the intended target. So this creates a lot of interesting double and even triple agent type possibilities. Remember how we talked about Stuxnet and how everyone is pretty sure that it was designed by the United States or Israel? But is that really the case? At least one observer thinks maybe not. Writing in Forbes, Jeffrey Carr, who's a well-known cyber writer, speculated that China might have been behind the Stuxnet worm. He linked the advent of Stuxnet to the failure of one of India's communication satellites. As a result of that failure, Indian service providers of direct-to-home telecommunications were forced to switch their traffic to a Chinese satellite, one owned by the Chinese government investors. According to Carr, the failed Indian satellite also runs on a Siemens SCADA interface of the exact same sort that Stuxnet targeted. This transfer of traffic was, of course, financially beneficial to China, who had a motive for inducing the change and for concealing its own role. Now, the speculation is probably wrong. The revelations about American involvement in Stuxnet are too detailed, I think, to be false. But Carr's guesswork does give you a sense of how uncertain identity is in cyberspace. Unfortunately, the problem of attribution and identification can't be wished away. The difficulty of identification is perhaps the single most profound challenge for cybersecurity today, for both technical and social reasons. It's not just that attribution is hard to do, though it is hard enough. It is that, as we explored a bit in Lecture 3, the converse of attribution, anonymity, is a fundamental part of our cyber consciousness. The anonymous internet stems from the architecture of the communications protocols, but it has been embedded as a quasi-libertarian streak that is at its core part of the DNA of internet society. For many of the people who first built the cyber domain, anonymity is part of their ideological commitment to a broad-based, diverse, individually empowered community. Let's leave the sociology of the internet aside for a moment and focus on exactly where we are today. Attribution is deeply problematic in cyberspace, and that makes the network vulnerable to attack. But problematic doesn't mean impossible. Think back to the story of the GhostNet intrusion we talked about in Lecture 4. The Information Warfare Monitor Group from Canada spent nearly a year on the effort and broke into some of the hackers' own computers to follow the trail. In the end, they were able to trace the origin of the intrusion to servers on Hainan Island, also the home of a Chinese military signals intelligence agency. What those efforts demonstrate is that when all is said and done, attribution is a question of resources and permission. If you are willing to devote enough time, money, and personnel to the issue, and if you have permission to do certain acts that in other contexts might be illegal, well, then good attribution can ultimately be achieved. The major problem with the effort, however, is that it takes a long time. How valuable is an attribution 6 months after the attack? Still, though attribution is slow and cautious, it can be done. In fact, one piece of recent good news on this front, at least from the perspective of the American military, is that in the right circumstances, we're getting better at identifying the malicious actors. As Secretary of Defense Leon Panetta said in October 2012, quote, "Over the last 2 years, DoD has made significant investments in forensics to address this problem of attribution. And we're seeing the returns on that investment. Potential aggressors should be aware that the United States has the capacity to locate them and to hold them accountable for their actions that may try to harm America." For example, the National Security Agency has, through patient and diligent work, identified roughly 20 separate Chinese networks of hackers that are causing most of the espionage damage in America today. These near 24 groups are either tied to the Chinese military directly or tied to Chinese universities with ties to the government. According to public reports, the U.S. government even knows the names of specific individuals in some of these groups. In fact, in 2012, some researchers at Trend Micro, which is a cybersecurity firm, began looking at a Chinese intrusion program called Lucky Cat. As usual, the attackers used internet cutouts, intermediate command and control computers, and domains located around the world so as to make it difficult to track them. But with careful work, the investigators linked one of the command and control domains to an email address, and then to a QQ address. QQ is, by the way, China's equivalent of Twitter. Now, that QQ address, in turn, was tied to an online nickname, Schuhker, S-C-U-H-K-R. Schuhker was almost certainly a reference to Sichuan University, whose internet domain name is scu.edu.cn. The CN is for China. After Trend Micro published its research, the New York Times went a step further. They conducted an additional investigation and discovered that the owner of the Shoehicker alias, where HKR stands for hacker, was, according to online records, Gu Kaiyuan, a former graduate student at Sichuan University. So we actually know who the hacker behind Lucky Cat is. Which brings us to the final problem with direct attribution efforts. The so